Hey dolls, it has been a while, and every reason for that is simply just an excuse you don't care about. Like, seriously. A lot of procrastination, mostly a lot of procrastination and poor time management. Also not being happy with previous takes, but, you know, let's ignore all that and get on with this. I completed the main quest of Tears of the Kingdom some time ago, and this is your only spoiler warning outside of the one in the title of this video, so proceed at your own caution. Also, I've yet to play Age of Calamity, so we're gonna ignore that game, which is fine, because Tears of the Kingdom does too. So when I first got my copy of Tears of the Kingdom, I played it straight for 20 hours. I don't even know if I went to the restroom. It gripped me like no other game had prior to it in a long, long time. It really brought me back to when I was a kid and playing Ocarina of Time with my best friend and anticipating Majora's Mask. It kicked up the nostalgia for me. It didn't take long for me to realize that Tears will be the game of the year in 2023, although, you know, since writing this script, a couple of contenders have come out, so we'll see how that goes. It's definitely going to be nominated. The year is not over though, but I don't think any of them will come close to how immersive and satisfying the gameplay is in Tears of the Kingdom. Could be wrong though. But there is one aspect of the new Zelda that other games may manage to do better, probably are doing better, and that is the narrative. And there's more focus on the story compared to Breath of the Wild, but, well, not much. Alright, so let's just start at the beginning. It starts with Zelda and Link exploring underneath Hyrule Castle. There has been a weird mist that has been spreading out, and anyone that goes near it falls ill. Eventually, we get to a section that has statues of a figure that can only be a Zonai, a member of an ancient tribe briefly mentioned in Breath of the Wild. They shortly come across several old murals that Zelda refers to as depicting the imprisoning war. Now, if you've played previous Zelda titles like me, you may have thought, ooh, this is referring to Skyward Sword, or the events that lead up to the story of that game. The big bad of that title was a dark god known as Demise, who was sealed away by the goddess Hylia. However, in the events of Skyward Sword, her seal on Demise is weakening, and he awakens in an accursed state for the majority of the game that is referred to as the Imprisoned. Already, the writing's pulling from previous titles. Eventually, Link and Zelda stumble upon who we, the player, know to be Ganondorf, who is held in place by a dismembered arm, which, of course, falls at that exact moment of the pair's approach, and is no longer able to maintain its spell. It drops a Magatama-shaped stone that we later learn is called a Secret Stone of the Zonai, which I'm going to refer to as a Zonai Stone for convenience's sake. Ganondorf immediately rises and unleashes his gloom towards her, but Link manages to protect her. Unfortunately, it saps him of most of his strength, corrupting his arm and severely damaging the Master Sword. While the Sword of Evil's Bane is currently not strong enough against the Demon King, it is still capable of hurting him. Upon seeing his power destroy the sword that was supposed to defeat him, Ganondorf mocks Link by stating Rauru placed his faith in him. And if you're old, like me, you recognize that name as the Sage of Light in Ocarina of Time. So we're pulling from previous titles and it hasn't even been 20 minutes. So after all of this, the ground gives way and Zelda falls, but before she lands into the depths, a bright light surrounds her and, as we later learn, she goes back far, far into Hyrule's past. The arm that was holding Ganondorf back also rescues Link and pulls him out of the depths. At this time, I was thinking, maybe we'll be getting an entry of the game whose story is akin to Skyward Sword in terms of revealing heavy lore behind the entire franchise. Nope. Breath of the Wild story was something the player had to discover on their own, opposed to most entries in the franchise where our progression is what has it unfold. Tears of the Kingdom befits a sequel to Breath of the Wild as it follows the same beats. Instead of memories, you collect dragon tears from geoglyphs found across Hyrule. Each tear contains a memory of Zelda after she disappeared and fell back in time. This is where we see the princess meet the first king of Hyrule, Rauru, a Zonai, and his Hylian wife, Sonia. This is also where we see most of Ganondorf, and we'll get to him. I ended up completing the Dragon Tears quest really early because I just wanted to see what Zelda was up to, and more with Rauru and Ganondorf. I also did them out of order, which kind of ruined things early. The second one I found was the Master Sword tier, where, from how the memory was edited, I knew that Zelda became a dragon, but I didn't know how until a few memories later. Now, that's just bad luck. To have the biggest story moment kind of ruined for you after only doing one temple. You can see the light dragon, what Zelda becomes, in order to heal and strengthen the Master Sword at the beginning of the game when Link first does his big skydive and after sending the Master Sword back in time. But I thought it was Farosh. I didn't realize there was a new dragon until getting the last dragon tier. I may have seen her floating around Hyrule, but she was so high in the sky at that point, I didn't bother approaching. It's one of those reveals that does speak something deeper into this world, namely the three dragons, Farosh, Naydra, and Dinral. That's a bit horrifying and fairly somber and heartbreaking. If there's going to be any more done with that story detail, it remains to be seen, but I find it unlikely, and I'm not holding my breath. The lead up to this game was full of fans speculating over the timeline and history of the Zelda franchise, and they still very much are speculating over that. And I was rather engaged in all this discussion, but playing Tears of the Kingdom cemented a hard truth. The timeline, I mean, it's a nice guide on how the games are connected, but it's of no true importance. Nintendo only cares about the current game they're working on, and if inconsistencies come up, well, so be it. I mean, I would love for there to be an overarching story across all these games, and it seemed as though we were going to be getting that in Tears of the Kingdom. Skyward Sword even really tried to tie them all together, and this was even backed up with the logo of the game being a dragon eating its tail to form an endless loop, otherwise known as an Ouroboros, an image usually depicting one snake or dragon swallowing its own tail, which represents the infinite, that the end of infinity is no different than its beginning. What many fans and myself thought and hoped was that we would be seeing what was essentially the beginning of everything, especially the events that lead up to Skyward Sword. My thoughts were, after watching all the trailers, was that we wind up falling back to the beginning of the timeline and witness Zelda become Hylia and Ganondorf turn into Demise, and the war between the two that eventually sent the Hylians to live in the Sky Islands. While Zelda does fall back in time, this is not at all what happens. It just turns out the Ouroboros loop is self-contained to Tears of the Kingdom story. Ganondorf awakens knowing who Link and Zelda are. That's because that Zelda already went back in time and assisted Rauru in sealing him. So everything, save for the part that is the game of Tears of the Kingdom, has already happened. Thus, the beginning is the end of the events prior to it. One of the major criticisms with Breath of the Wild was the narrative is rather lacking compared to more recent entries in the franchise. I was hopeful they would improve upon that in Tears of the Kingdom, and the final result was a bit. And it was a bit better than Breath of the Wild's narrative. It's nice to see what's new in all of the villages, mostly dealing with new troubles after the upheaval, and even then, you see that Hyrule is flourishing with the threat of Calamity Ganon over, and they mention how Zelda has been actively trying to rebuild the kingdom. I like that Terry Town is thriving, Hateno has their own city politics going on. Lurelin, unfortunately, has been ransacked by pirates, and I haven't done that side quest yet, so I can't really say much about it. I was hoping to see more changes in the villages of the other races, but I understand they wanted to keep the map mostly the same, save for the vertical layers. Many gamers joke about how it's just $70 DLC or an expansion, but that's rather unfair, because there are new gaming mechanics and changes done that would be just too expensive for any studio to make it a DLC. So while playing Tears of the Kingdom, it reminded me of two games. First, Final Fantasy X-2. At the end of Final Fantasy X, Yuna is able to bring the Eternal Calm to Spira, and the sequel spends a good amount of time exploring how a world adjusts after the end of a long threat. The beginning of the game is mostly revisiting places and people we met in the first one. We see villages that were once destroyed are rebuilt. Kids we met have grown up. A shift in the country's politics, and people who feel as though they can truly enjoy themselves without the silent fear it can end at any moment. Revisiting Hyrule and Tears of the Kingdom felt much like that, but in both games, it isn't so simple. The peace that they struggle to attain can very well be taken away, and it will need constant vigilance and cooperation to maintain. And that brings us to Ganondorf. While I stated my thoughts on the timeline, let's have some fun with it here. The timeline starts with Skyward Sword, the Minish Cap, Four Swords Adventure, and then Ocarina of Time. I don't want to spend the time going over the story, but Ocarina of Time involves time travel shenanigans that create 3 different timelines. While Ganon has been the main villain since the first game, Ocarina of Time is the introduction of Ganondorf, who uses his magic to become Ganon. So while the hero and Princess Zelda are different people in each game, Ganondorf and Ganon aren't. They've been considered to be the different fates of Ganondorf depending on which strand of the timeline the game you play is in. However, the Ganondorf in Tears of the Kingdom is not the same one we meet in Ocarina of Time, nor does he have the Triforce of Power. The one commonality they have, aside from their name, is being the lone male Gerudo born every century. A major complaint and genuine issue in Breath of the Wild was that Calamity Ganon is not a great villain. It was more or less the dark energy and power that normally is what composes the dark forces that Link and Princess Zelda go up against in their multiple lives, or that's how I'm gonna look at it, and, well, it's a little bit of part of the problem. Calamity Ganon is just mindless chaos that's being contained. It's hard to describe how intelligent it is. It does seem to corrupt the same tech that defeated it in a previous era, which shows that it does have some capability of learning from its mistakes. But a mindless evil with no true thought, no sentience, it's kind of boring. The boss battle wasn't much to write home about either. Fighting him in Hyrule Castle was a bit difficult for me at first. There's more challenge to him if you don't free all the divine beasts, as you have to fight the various Ganon Blights first, but it's a fairly decent fight. It's his final phase most players took issue with, when he's in his Dark Beast mode. I mean, there's no real strategy. You just ride your horse around and shoot the glowing weak spots. No real danger to yourself. Breath of the Wild didn't have great boss fights until the DLC, where you fight the Ganon Blights, this time with limitations. It's likely a simulation of the fight that they had with the champions prior to their death. And you can also go up against Maz Koshia, a Sheikah monk you fight in order to get Link's own divine beast. Yeah, apparently they made one for the hero incarnate, and we could have had it a little sooner in our quest. I don't know why you decided to give it to me after I've freed all the other divine beasts, but silly me. Tears of the Kingdom fortunately improves the boss fights significantly. I mentioned that Tears of the Kingdom reminded me of 2 games, and the second game is actually one that I briefly touched upon in a previous video, how Breath of the Wild was inspired by Shadow of the Colossus. And I felt like that influence also continued into Tears of the Kingdom in a different way. Where Breath of the Wild embraced the more quiet, solemn atmosphere of Ueda's work, Tears of the Kingdom captured it with the boss fights. The first boss I fought was Colgera, and it was like fighting a Colossus again. The dragons are very similar as well. They're as large as the 13th Colossus, but their bodies, the shape of them, especially when you're on their back, they very much resemble the 7th. Now, I've yet to properly take down a Gleeok and a Lynel in Tears of the Kingdom. I'm not that good, but the boss is major improvement. Now, the final fight with Ganondorf was also an improvement over Calamity Ganon. You first have to beat his army, which is just a monster horde. Then the bosses from the various temples pop up. Now, similar to Breath of the Wild and the Divine Beasts, you can skip this fight if you have awakened all 5 sages, otherwise you have to fight them all. I find it kind of funny that regardless of how you approach reaching the end of the game, the developers are insistent on you fighting the core bosses here. It's like, you know, we put a lot of time and hard work into making these bosses and designing these mechanics. You are not going to skip them. You will fight them, and I will make you fight them. Then you go to the deepest depths of Hyrule, where Ganondorf waits. The first phase is the fight with the Gerudo King that provides a bit of a challenge, but one that most players will be adequate and skilled to take on. And I will admit, I wish it was a bit more difficult in a way like From Software's games are. Maybe in upcoming DLC we can get a master mode that adds that challenge. Once you defeat the first phase, Ganondorf embraces the power of the Zonai Stone and becomes the Demon King, and gains one hell of a health bar, like he's compensating for something. This phase can be difficult if you don't have the sages, but they'll take on the phantoms he summons so you can focus on the big guy. Once you deplete half of his health, Ganondorf uses his gloom to shake off the sages, so it's a solo fight again. This time he cheats by using moves that, I'm only allowed to use, thank you. While you can still be afflicted with gloom, this isn't a problem if you have the proper healing items and potions. But he also gains the ability to take away one of your hearts, so your own health is depleted in a manner you can't recover. If you're familiar with fights against Ganon, well, you know what the last phase will be. While he normally turns into a giant boar, I mean, we already had that, and we don't want it again, thank you. But if you've been paying attention to the story told in the Dragon Tears, you know where this is going. Ganondorf becomes the demon dragon, and it's gnarly. Oh, God, this thing is so... Ooh, it's metal. How else can you describe it? It's metal. But I love how its birth resembles Calamity Ganon rising from Hyrule Castle. And, you know, it is a fairly simple fight. It's not too complicated, but there is a grand scale to it that just gives a significant edge up over Calamity Beast Ganon. And I also love that Light Dragon, Princess Zelda, still remembers her duty and assists Link in fighting the Demon Dragon. A part of her is still alive and is actively helping us. Ganondorf makes a wonderful final boss to play against, but how does he fare in a narrative sense? He's above Calamity Ganon, which is a low bar. Unfortunately, his potential is wasted. The lead up to the game were abound with theories. I myself was hoping that perhaps there would be a twist where Ganondorf was betrayed, perhaps the Gerudo were genuinely being slighted by the royal family, or the previous hero and Zelda incarnations weren't in the moral right. Alas, no. Ganondorf's just evil and power-hungry. There's nothing else to his motives. He's just the bad guy, duh. It's so disappointing. The design for all phases of him is superb, top-notch, chef's kiss. Mwah. Oh, but I prefer the Demon King look, if we want to go there. Love the samurai flair to all of it, though. Oh gosh, I want to bring attention to Demon King Ganondorf's design for a moment, as it seems to pull from Demise or the Imprisoned with the scales. And, you know, this is just a fun fact. The Triforce is based off the crest of the Hojo clan, which was an old Japanese family that once held power centuries ago. The crest itself is known as the Mitsu Uroko, which means 3 scales. You see the scales reflected in much of the Zonai's motif on their outfits and jewelry. There are the Triforce-like decorations on Raru's garb, and even the egg-shaped earrings both Zelda and Sonia wear are scaled. I don't know if it means much or anything like that. I just, you know, it's a nice little detail. I also love that he draws his power from the moon, not because that ties into the blood moon so nicely, but it's also unusual to see that with male characters due to the feminine associations the moon has, which could be a nice subtle lore detail on Gerudo's sorcery. But, well, when it comes to how villains are written, and this is a personal thing, but I think many of you, if you think about it, can agree. You know, villains whose end goal is to simply destroy the world is just bad writing. Yeah, because then it becomes like, okay, once you've destroyed the world, then what? I mean, you really want to be the ruler of nothing? I mean, what's the end game once you've accomplished your goal? That's all you want to be, is just the strongest guy? I mean, after you've defeated all other obstacles, what's left of you? No motive is given outside of power hunger, and, well, power is just what bad people want and seek. It's lazy, and I have no idea how other players feel about it, but if they think this Ganondorf is a good antagonist and the best Nintendo villain, no. Hot take here. Bowser is a better written villain than Ganondorf. Bowser at least has a goal with an endgame in mind, to marry Princess Peach. Yes, it's problematic, what have you, but at least, you know, there's a life that he wants to have with her once he reaches his goal. It's a far more interesting motivation, and that's fairly revealing of his character, you know, because the recent Super Mario Bros. Movie came out. I enjoyed it. There's this part where he tells Princess Peach he stole the Power Star so he could take over the world with her at his side. All right. So, that's like really romantic. I mean, wait, you stole the Power Star to take over the world. Not only that, but you want me to rule with you? I mean, I don't agree with all of your policies, but, you know, you wouldn't mind if I threw in some of my 2 cents every once in a while, would you? All right, let's get back on track here. I realized something while writing this. Ganondorf is a puppet master, but not much else. If you disagree with me, please go a little bit more in depth on it. But for me, I feel like that's a little bit stating the obvious, and it really is so much more here. While he does play a literal puppet master with his phantoms, one of them being in the guise of Zelda in this game, and the reveal that included the Zelda and the Blood Moon sequence was nice. There's a bit of a problem with his underlings often outshining him. Even though I know Ganon is the villain of A Link to the Past, I associate the primary villain as Aghanim, as that's who it was for most of my time playing it as a kid. Zant was a breath of fresh air as the antagonist of Twilight Princess, but once we learn that he's actually being used by Ganondorf and is serving him, well, the character's personality flips, and it's like, oh, this again. And while Girahim is technically Demise's underling, I mean, he also fits the bill. Part of the problem is that Ganondorf is often in the background of the games, and his presence in the story is often underwhelming. I think some fans are going to mention Wind Waker here. Now, confession, I've never finished Wind Waker, for the same reasons why I'm never going to play Subnautica. The ocean's scary. But from what I recall and know of the story, that was the best writing the character ever had. Ganondorf had finally broken free from his imprisonment and sought revenge against the reincarnation of the hero and Princess Zelda's descendant. It was a personal conflict Ganondorf carried in his motivations that led to the kidnapping of the hero's sister Auril that also got the player invested in this quest to begin with. And, well, that leads into the conflict between Link and Ganondorf. It doesn't really exist between the two of them in Tears of the Kingdom. The actual conflict is between Ganondorf and Rauru, with Link being dragged into their beef. One thing that probably would have made it a little better is Link having a more significant relationship with Rauru. I was hopeful at the start he would be a companion similar to Midna in Twilight Princess, but as he's the first king of Hyrule, he winds up being a parallel with King Rome. I also believe the role I wanted him to have ultimately fell to his sister Minaru, but if you follow the outlined path, I mean, you unlock her fairly late in the game, and there's so little time to spend with her to develop any sort of bond. Honestly, didn't feel invested in the major conflict. I felt like I was just going through the motions of what is expected of the hero in a heroic quest, but without any attachment to the world I'm supposed to be saving. Again. I believe that the biggest thing holding back the modern Zelda titles, the new Switch titles, well, happens to be the hero themselves. Link, or more accurately, how little character Link has. Now, this is a topic that's worthy of its own video essay, but I guess it's best to bring it up here as, well, it's part of the main problem for me. Link is considered a silent protagonist, a unique protagonist to the medium of video games where they never utter a single word. This doesn't mean that the character is mute or nonverbal, simply that they are never given dialogue outside of a menu prompt. Link being a silent protagonist began as, well, just the nature of game design in the early days, but as the technology progressed, he continued to not being given any true dialogue. The design philosophy is that a silent protagonist allows the player to feel more immersed in the video game. It supposedly allows us to project ourselves onto the player character. Now, this is purely my opinion, but unless we're dealing with a blank slate player character like the ones in From Software games, I don't feel as though I'm the protagonist in games featuring player stand-ins. I get why game designers want to have the player character be a projection of the player, but I would honestly prefer playing an actual character with a concrete personality and history. During my replay of Breath of the Wild, I was frustrated with Link's lack of character in the memories, especially the ones based off the photos found in the Sheikah Slate. I'm supposed to be recovering Link's memories, but I'm actually just seeing everything from Zelda's point of view. There are some moments where we do learn a bit about Link in these scenes. They're told to us rather than shown, which is always great for visual media to do. But the most infuriating thing is the lack of expression from Link in every single one of these memories. He just has the same blank expression on his face regardless of the situation. I don't know how he feels towards any of these people like Zelda and Mipha. I get that they're important to him because I'm told they are, but, I mean, it feels so hollow. When Link manages to pull the Master Sword out of the Light Dragon, Zelda's head, we hear her final thoughts prior to her transformation. And how does Link handle all of this knowledge that the princess he was devoted to guarding is now stuck as an immortal dragon? Who knows, because his face is just his default expression as it is in every cutscene. He's only expressive when he cooks, as he hums to and chuckles to himself. I mean, yeah, I love food too, but when it comes to the narrative, I mean, he's blank, and it pulls me out. I don't want to play a hollow character who doesn't react to the world around him. If I cannot connect with the main character, how am I to connect to the story and the world that they're in? And before anyone mentions the adventure log in the Japanese version is supposed to be Link's point of view, I don't care. I played the English version, and I didn't read the adventure log anyways. That's a cop-out excuse to have all of his characterization to be in the menu, and you know it. With all that complaining, though, I can sort of excuse it in Breath of the Wild, as Link has lost all of his memories and just woke up from his century-long nap. Even if his memories were intact, the natural course of life and time would still have him wake up to a drastically different Hyrule. All the champions are dead alongside most of the citizens he knew, whether due to the calamity or just the natural course of life. In Tears of the Kingdom, it's only been a few years. And yet I felt even more divorced from this Hyrule. A huge problem is that Breath of the Wild happened, but it might as well not have. All of the Sheikah shrines and towers are gone. The guardians that were decaying in various parts of Hyrule have been uprooted. Even the divine beasts are nowhere to be seen. I get why, in terms of game design, it would be unnecessary clutter for the new game as their purpose is over. I also believe that Nintendo didn't want to alienate players who hadn't played Breath of the Wild, so they seldom mentioned it. But fuck those players. Sorry you didn't play one of the most innovative games in the past 6 years, but decide to play its direct sequel. You deserve to miss out on some prior knowledge. Worst of all is that some of the characters I interacted with in Breath of the Wild didn't remember me in Tears of the Kingdom. This was usually the standard NPCs, like the little boy who kept wanting to see all these weapons in Hateno Village. He didn't recognize me. Weirder yet was listening to the NPCs talk about Zelda as if I didn't know her. I'm her appointed knight. She took over my house. I ought to be going around Hyrule with her and be just as familiar to all the people just as much as she is. Especially since I'm the one who saved their ass. You know, Master Koga returns in this game, and honestly, he's one of the highlights of Tears of the Kingdom for me. In part because he's the only motherfucker from Breath of the Wild that remembers me. Love that. He was just a great character in this game. A huge problem between the relationship between Link and Zelda is that Nintendo wants to suggest a close relationship between the two, but not too close, because that would have romantic leanings. Even though Zelda herself does have those sorts of feelings towards Link. I know many fans were excited to see Zelda had moved into the home that was considered Link's house in the previous title. But then we see there's no room for Link anywhere, and you can build a new house outside of Terrytown, thus suggesting that Link no longer lives in Hateno Village. It's Zelda's house now, baby, and we just would crash there occasionally, I guess. It's not great to have such wishy-washy writing between the most prominent characters in your game. I think part of this has to do with Nintendo is just they're scared of having Link and Zelda wind up being lovers because that may impact future plans for the next title or the title after that, which is a bit silly as they have a well-established formula of each game essentially being a new story with new characters sharing the same name and physique. And to get back onto the conflict, again, Ganondorf has beef with Rauru, not with Link. I'm saving Hyrule because someone has to, but this is a Hyrule Link should have a better attachment to, and yet he doesn't. One could argue, well, Zelda disappeared. Isn't that enough motivation for Link? You know, normally I would agree, but once you learn she's the Light Dragon, I mean, there's little we can do about it. Zelda isn't being held captive by Ganondorf, nor is he directly responsible for the state she's currently in. So when I had learned of Zelda becoming the Light Dragon and told Impa about it, her dialogue suggested that she was going to look up a way to return Zelda to her Hylian self. And I was thinking, Oh, so if I, like, start a new game and I just skip straight to Ganondorf at the very beginning without doing any of the main quests, there would be an ending where Zelda remains a dragon. And that turns out not to be the case at all. If only Nintendo were so brave. It turns out Zelda just returns to her Hylian self via Deus Ex Machina, whether you do the Dragon's Tear quest or not. And I've been referring to Link as the main character, but that's simply because we play as him. That doesn't mean he is the main character. I actually believe the Switch titles are the first time where Zelda is actually the main character of the franchise that bears her name. The memories we find in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are relevant to Zelda's experiences and her growth as a character. And yet, Nintendo insists on not having us play as her in a main franchise game. No, we don't want to play as her in some spin-offs, and we don't want to play as her as a phantom possessing a set of armor a la Full Metal Alchemist. No, you know what we want. We want to control her flesh and blood in a main franchise game. And you won't give it to us. You finally give us a Zelda game where she's the main character and you won't let us play as her. The only concrete moments of Link's character is all available in diary entries that the player may or may not ever read. I believe Mipha mentions how drawn in Link has become, and Zelda also brings up part of why Link is so quiet is that he chooses to go along with whatever people expect of him as his role of the hero. It's a shame we don't get to play this exploration of Link out in the game, and that we have to read it. Another big problem is that now there's full voice acting, which means Link's name is definitively Link. Otherwise, we create a Final Fantasy X situation where the writers kept the convention of giving the playable character whatever name the player wants, and then writing the dialogue to have every character avoid saying Tidus's name and voiced lines. Even though we could name him something other than Link, he was still given expressions and personality that was more engaging as a player. I understand there's some hesitation on Nintendo's side to change things too much with the Switch titles. The leap to fully voiced cutscenes was one that many players were nervous about, but I honestly think they appropriately save it only for major story events. While it isn't strange for Link to be silent still, I do think they could have given him some voiced lines in cutscenes. I mean, it would be a bit truer to his character in the world they've set up, and would make the true ending of Tears of the Kingdom less comical. It's hilarious to see the sages declare a vow to Zelda and Link just stands there. He's just standing there. I believe that the progress the player can make through the story can be done in any order has also contributed to the weaker narrative as previous titles play out in a tighter, linear fashion, which is a bad thing nowadays. One of the biggest complaints, and one that I agree with, is that the cutscene that happens after we complete a temple, defeat the boss, and awaken a sage is essentially identical. You would think the Lightning Sage, the one that is of the Gerudo, the same race as Ganondorf, would have more of an emotional conflict about everything that happened and to impart on Riju, considering that, hey, the guy who is trying to destroy everything, the guy who you have to actively fight, was actually one of our own. And you would think that would mean something to Riju, but no. Her dialogue is barely any different than the Goron, Rito, and Zora sages, who, let's just be honest, are all copy-paste versions of the champions. Especially the male ones. They do something a little different with the ladies, but they're basically copy-paste. I get why they keep it the same. You can do these temples in any order, but you know, it's also not that difficult to write it in a way that we're not watching the same cutscene 4 times. It was just disappointing that while Tears of the Kingdom is phenomenal and improving and building upon Breath of the Wild, which itself was a shakeup of the Zelda formula and open world design, to see it play so safe in terms of the narrative that it winds up being rather bland is so disheartening. Having this new world to explore, to see all the new changes, and then you have these new sky islands and this whole layer underneath Hyrule that's just really very fascinating to play out, but at the same time, I really want to spend more time with the rich new characters, and for you to take more risks and do something new with the villain and the protagonist to actually have us feel a bit more of an attachment to them. You know, I wanted to spend time with some of these new characters. I wanted to spend more time with Rauru and Sonia and Taro. They create these really great characters, and they're characters I want to spend more time with, but they deprive me of that. And I really wish they would just further flesh out their story. That sums up my critical thoughts on Tears of the Kingdom's narrative. And I see a lot of people are still speculating on the timeline, where Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom falls on that. Maybe it falls to the side of it. I see them theorizing on the DLC and the Ancient Heroes aspect as well as the dragons, but for me, I'm sorry y'all, I can't be bothered. It really just comes across, it's not important to Nintendo. I think part of my disappointment with Tears of the Kingdom story is that I was speculating much like everyone else, and what I wanted wasn't delivered, and what I got was not much better. That's very gloomy, but sorry about that. I'm very sorry about that. I don't mean to be. I did overall very much enjoy Tears of the Kingdom. I really want to finish more of the side quests. I'm definitely going to be playing some of the DLC. I'm anticipating DLC, especially some story DLC. I really need to get to playing Age of Calamity, because that looks like a lot of fun. I was replaying Hyrule Warriors in between my replay of Breath of the Wild and starting Tears of the Kingdom. And when I was playing Hyrule Warriors, I was like, oh, maybe I should have taken this opportunity to play Age of Calamity. And I think it would be fantastic if we get a Hyrule Warriors where we can play as Rauru and this version of Ganondorf. I mean, I don't know what the story of that would involve, but you want it. I know you do. I know some of you do. I can't be alone in this. Oh my god, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your patience after a long hiatus, and for watching this video. Please like and subscribe for more Nerd Dog content. I will be making more. I promise you. I fully intend to continue this. And I thank you once again, for you have been a doll.